Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Glass Painters by Sarah Brown and David O'Connor. This is part of the Medieval Craftsmen series. I've also reviewed Scribes and Illuminators from this series and I really liked that book, so I placed a hold on a couple more in that series and Glass Painters is one of them. Unfortunately, the library did put a huge sticker on the front of the book, which kind of ruins the effect of the cover, but as you can tell, there's this very beautiful stained glass window also featured on the cover, and the craft of building these stained glass windows, which we associate with medieval churches, is the focus of this book. So I'm going to discuss what you can expect when you read this book, the content that is covered in the book, and parts of the book that I found interesting, as well as things I wish the book had done that would have made the book maybe nicer to read, or things that I wish had been improved upon on this book, so you know what to expect if you choose to purchase or read this book. And as always, leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section down below. So let's jump in and talk about Glass Painters. So the medieval church, the stained glass windows, which are not just found in medieval churches, but I feel like that's the most common location for them, are very visible even today, but frequently we don't think about who built those windows, or that's not something that I think about a lot of. And this comes down to the origin and also the idea of whether the people who built this were artists or craftsmen. And this kind of gets into a differentiation, which I know there's been a lot of ink spilled over on whether a particular form of work is a piece of art or falls under the term craft, which I feel like is usually devalued a little bit. And the first part of this book, called Artists, discusses this problem. So these were paid professionals in the Middle Ages who were able to build and craft these beautiful windows that are featured throughout this book. And these are serious pieces of work. But slowly throughout years, the idea of working with glass and windows has become devalued, and it has become more of something that you do as a craft. It's not viewed as a serious art. It's relegated as more of a minor art. And for that reason, as clearly explained, it's on page 11 that says very clearly that when the medium becomes devalued, the artists who work in that field become devalued as well. And that's what's kind of happened with these glass painters. I wonder, this book was published in 1991, if in the last 30 years, ideas have kind of changed around this, but at least in the early 1990s and from the perspective of these authors, they seem to feel like this art had been devalued and it was usually referred to in a negative context as just a craft that was done, some skilled labor that was being performed, and therefore wasn't worthy of deep investigation. And that's where this book comes in to kind of correct those assumptions. The next section of this book, and I'm just going through the contents to kind of discuss what's in these sections, is the the status and organization. So the first part deals with the artist, or actually the first section deals with the origin, but then the second section deals with the artist, the craftsman. Three views or discusses status and organization. And this section, the status and organization chapter, discusses two parts. The first is really the names and positions of glass painters within society. And something that was really clear in this part to me, or very interesting in this part, was the role that women would play. So we see, particularly when a man dies, his wife would take over the family business. So the woman is running the family business. And there was this initial assumption that the woman was just managing the business side or the accounting side, but it became clear from further investigation from the authors that some of these women were actually trained in the craft itself, and they were able to keep doing this glass working and this glass painting to put together these beautiful church windows or these beautiful castle windows wherever they were being contracted to work. So some of these women had skills and were able to work in their field. So there was this family affair level to things. Additionally, the widows of glass painters tended to marry other glass painters, assuming men who were single or otherwise widowers. So they were able to kind of keep everything together. So women had a role to play in this, which was interesting to me because I definitely would have assumed that the glass working, glass making, the glass painting sphere would have been almost entirely men. But there is evidence that women were involved in this as well. In the first part of the Middle Ages, as we can imagine, there's really not a lot known about specific names on people who worked on these beautiful church windows. It's very much shrouded in anonymity. But as we get into the later Middle Ages, people began putting their names in things. And we do have some records which indicate who maybe was contracted to do this work, but a lot of it, especially in the beginning, was very anonymous. The later part of the Middle Ages was less anonymous, as artists were able to assign their name to works, but also in the second half of the Middle Ages there was a lot more cross-fertilization across the European continent. So initially it was very local and there were very local styles, but as artists began to move about, they could share ideas and techniques and strategies, and ideas about what was artistic and different tastes could spread around and cross-fertilize and result in a lot more interesting things coming out of this glassworking area, this glassworking field. The second part of the status and organization focuses on guilds. So guilds are organizations that are created usually and particularly in the Middle Ages to have or allow the craftsmen or the people in the guild to have a level of power, but also to protect things like the standard of work. So the guilds were organized around glass painting. They had their own guilds and they worked together to make sure that they were protected. There were rules about how many apprentices you could take on, and some of this was done in order to ensure that people were being appropriately trained so that their standard of work wouldn't suffer. However, particularly in England, there was a decrease in the guilds, a fall of guilds, around 1540, and this happened because the guild had provided such strict guidelines in apprenticeship and rules, and there was an influx going back to in the late Middle Ages. There was a lot of movement of artists around Europe. There was an influx of innovative practices coming from the Low Countries in Europe, which the native being English glass painters just couldn't compete with in England, and so the guild appealed to the king to maintain their standards, and that cry apparently fell on deaf ears because the guilds kind of lost power around the 1540s, which we would assume is close to the end of the Middle Ages. The next section after the status and organization, so that's discussing who was making these and in what organization, the guild organization, we move into another key feature of art in the Middle Ages, and I would say also in the Renaissance, which is the patron. The patron comes up again and again in many things I read about medieval art, and that is because many of these pieces needed to be commissioned from someone and needed a patron to provide money. You needed someone with excess funds, excess spending money, disposable income to make a stained glass window. That isn't something that everyone can afford to put in their house, so you need someone who is wealthy to do it. Very interestingly enough, as mentioned earlier, a lot of the artists are anonymous because we don't have their names, but the patrons are very rarely anonymous, it feels like, because they are always putting themselves in the window, praying in a particularly religious scene, or we have a record of a contract that survived with them wanting a particular window or a particular item commissioned from the glass painter. So the patrons who really funded a lot of this work that we see is almost in many cases more well known than the artists who actually put together the work. And the patron and the patronage system really fueled a lot of this work that was being done. The patron system is not just found in glass painting, it's found in many art, but we can imagine that it functioned very similarly in glass painting because of the nature of not everyone having disposable income. There was also a connection with religious devotedness. I'm blanking on the word. You could commission a window to show that you were dedicated to the church in a window, and that would be a way of showing that you were a committed Christian in life. You could have one commissioned after your death. The next section of the book discusses the techniques and the technical process of making the window, so that just describes how these windows were technically made. And I should also add that throughout the book there are examples of what is being talked about. I should probably be holding these up as is. The making of the window section for me was a little bit technical just because I had never worked with glass before, but it was enjoyable to read. They also took time. This picture is a good example to explain older techniques versus newer techniques. Also throughout the book there's discussions on what sort of glass survives better, how the colors were added to the glass, how the glass was fired and at what temperature to be created, and how it was transported. So the making of these windows, as we can imagine, is quite technically complex. We see here there were samples that were being used to create the window, so you'd sketch it out beforehand and you could mark what colors you wanted. So there's quite a number of examples on how these windows were put together in that section. The final section is called Destruction and Preservation, and this is kind of the end of the stained glass windows, but there is a key feature which kind of saved it in a way that other things were not saved from the Middle Ages. The big change that occurred would be the Reformation. The breaking up of the power of the medieval Catholic Church had a massive impact on history, on European history, on many, many things. And when areas turned to be Protestant, were no longer associated with the Catholic Church, there was sometimes destruction of things that were seen as too Catholic, things that maybe praised the Pope or other things that were associated with the Catholic faith. And many of these windows that were created, although not all windows were created in religious settings, there were some secular settings, many of these windows that the glass painters were working on were for religious settings. And for that reason, a lot of them had Catholic imagery in it. So there was a lot of destruction of, at that time, things that were seen as Catholic. However, windows were actually spared many times. There were some specific features where maybe a saint's face was smashed out and just replaced with nothing. But in a lot of these cases, it would be very expensive to smash these windows out and put plain glass in, and they served a functional capacity. They weren't just decorative, although they did have a decorative and artistic element. They also were there to keep the elements out. So in many cases, they were spared during these very violent purges that I guess occurred during the Reformation. And for that reason, we do have many of these still around. Now, there was a second round that was quite destructive, and that was World War II. When I was reading this book, I began thinking how have these windows survived, and I have to imagine many windows did not survive the bombing that the European continent and also Great Britain experienced during World War II. But there were some interesting pictures. For example, this window has been removed. So I guess in some cases, this is again a just one brief insert, but I guess some of these windows were removed when there was threats of bombing so that they could be preserved, which was definitely some good foresight. But World War II was quite destructive, and windows were destroyed at that time. Sadly, many, many things were destroyed and many, many lives were lost. Windows were the least of concern during World War II, I have to imagine, but that was a point of destruction, and we do have instances where people did work to save their windows from destruction by being taken out. So as the bombing occurred, they hopefully would survive in wherever they were being shipped off to. So despite the destructive tendencies of some things that occurred during the Reformation or some other Catholic imagery that was destroyed during the Reformation, the windows, even with their Catholic imagery, in many cases could be saved because they also had a functional capacity that was being served and therefore are still there for us to enjoy to this day. Some thoughts on this book overall. Obviously, it's a very thin book. It's just 60 pages, so you're only going to get a very high-level overview, and I expect that. I'm not expecting a deep dive, and of course, we're moving through everything at a very high speed because the authors can't stop to dive into anything. I think this is designed to give you an overview of the technique, the history, the people involved, the general arc, the general course of the art throughout history. It's not designed to dwell on anything. If you find anything interesting in this book, it's up to you to go explore it further. I think it is a solid entry. One thing, and I have to imagine, I did find this with the other books in this Medieval Craftsmen series, I believe I have to imagine it's a money-saving technique, is the use of a lot of pictures in black and white instead of color. There is some color, but there's also plenty of black and white. I have to imagine, again, it's a cost-saving measure, but particularly when you're dealing with stained glass, I feel like I want to see these in color. It just seems kind of sad to have the colors stripped or reduced, even if they're trying to not show a color necessary technique. They seem kind of sad and a little dull. So I wish that they had all been reproduced in color, but obviously this book is from 1991. They're not going to reprint it in color just for my whim, but that was something to note. There is plenty of color, and I feel like especially in this book, they were cognizant of the fact that the color of the stained glass windows is a key feature of it. So many of them were put in color, but I wish they had all been in color. I think it just would have enhanced the book overall. There was a heavy focus on England in this book. Now, I'm not sure if that's because that's where many of these were found. Many of these examples still could be if that's where the authors were most familiar with, or that's where many of these windows survived either from the Reformation or bombing during World War II. I'm not sure what the reason was. I also wish that the authors had included a map, because at many points places were just being thrown around as though you were familiar with every single place in England. So I wish at some point, especially when talking about where maybe items came from, they just had included, and this could have been black and white, a simple map off to the side showing where they were talking about to include some more context for people who were outside of that area to, yeah, place on a map. I think that would have been very, very interesting. I also found very interesting in a positive light about what was included in this book is how much information was gleaned from non-artistic sources. So it wasn't just looking at the paintings or the manuscripts. In this case, for the glass, there was some looking at the glass to deduce from it, but there was a lot deduced from non-artistic sources. Things like tax rolls, internal contracts, surveys, census records. We have all these other things that may not seem to relate to glassmaking or glass painting at all, and yet we can use that to build a story around glass painting. So I found that very interesting, how many of these first glance art sources could be used to build a story around this particular art form. I really enjoyed it, and I felt like that was a very interesting and unique way of approaching the topic. Overall, this is an older but an enjoyable book. Again, I really wish that it had been reproduced mostly in color. I think this is a good starting point, and because it's so old, I feel like 30 isn't so old, but because it's from 1990s, I think that maybe better books have been published since then. But for that reason, I think you could probably get a copy of this book for relatively inexpensive. So if you find a used copy of this book, it may be interesting to pick up if you want an introduction to glass painting in the medieval times. If you've read this book or have any thoughts on this, please leave it in the comment section down below. I love to receive your comments. They make my day. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.